The scale in his own barn read 1,480 pounds. The ticket handed to him 3 days later at the sale barn read 1,410. 70 pounds, gone, on paper, between one Tuesday morning and one Friday afternoon. Marcus Teller stood at the scale house window holding that ticket a little longer than he needed to, running the subtraction in his head, even though he'd already done the math twice before the clerk finished printing it. 70 pounds on a cow that size wasn't pocket change. At the price that day's market was paying, it was real money. Money he'd already mentally spent on a loan payment due at the end of the month. He didn't accuse anybody, not yet. He just knew, standing there, that somewhere between his barn and this scale house, 70 pounds had gone somewhere, and he intended to find out exactly where. If you enjoy stories where experience and careful observation reveal what others miss, subscribe to the Rural Files. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far a story like this one travels. Marcus Teller was 51 years old, running a modest commercial cow-calf operation on land his family had worked for 3 generations outside a small town in central Nebraska. He wasn't a large operator by any stretch, around 110 head on a good year, but he'd built a reputation over 3 decades for producing sound, well-managed cattle, the kind of quiet credibility that mattered more in that business than flash ever did. The cow in question was a registered Angus he'd raised from a calf, a deep-bodied, easy-fleshing animal he'd privately considered one of the best-uttered, most consistent producers in his herd. He hadn't planned on selling her, but an equipment loan balloon payment was coming due, a payment he'd structured years earlier, when interest rates looked friendlier, and this particular cow, culled for age after her last calf was weaned, represented one of his cleaner paths to raising the difference without touching his working capital. He wasn't desperate. Marcus didn't operate that way, but he was careful with numbers in the way farmers who've weathered a few bad years learn to be, and 70 pounds sitting unaccounted for on a sale that mattered to his cash flow was not something he was inclined to shrug off. The morning he weighed her at home, everything about the process was ordinary. His own scale, a mechanical platform scale he'd had calibrated that spring by a technician who served half the county, sat inside a covered chute at the edge of his working corrals. He'd walked her onto it around 7 in the morning, after overnight access to feed and water, same as he always did before recording a weight he intended to rely on. The needle settled, held steady, and Marcus wrote the number down in the same weathered spiral notebook he'd used for cattle records for longer than he cared to admit. 1480. He didn't think much more about it that morning. It was simply a data point, the kind he collected on dozens of animals a year, mostly out of habit and partly because habit, in his experience, was what kept a small operation solvent when nothing else did. 3 days later, he hauled her to the regional livestock auction 2 counties over, the same sale barn his father had used, the same one Marcus had sold cattle through for most of his adult life. The auction yard that Friday was its usual controlled chaos. Trailers backed up along the unloading chute, the low, constant murmur of cattle in the holding pens, buyers in canvas coats leaning against rails comparing notes on that week's market, the auctioneer's voice occasionally drifting out from the sale ring in bursts of rapid, rhythmic numbers. Marcus unloaded her, walked her through intake, and settled into the stands to wait, same as always. She sold well, by the sound of the bidding. Solid interest from 2 regular buyers who recognized good breeding stock when they saw it. Marcus felt reasonably satisfied watching the numbers climb. Then the settlement ticket came through, and the weight line stopped him cold. 1,410 pounds. Not 1480, 1410. He stood there doing the subtraction that didn't need doing, because he'd already done it before the ink was dry. 70 pounds, missing, translated directly into dollars he'd been counting on having. He found Dean Foss, the scale house operator, before he left the yard that day. Not angry, just direct, the way Marcus generally was about anything that touched his bottom line. Dean had run that scale for going on 15 years, and he'd clearly fielded this exact conversation more times than he could count. He wasn't defensive about it. He pulled up the auction's calibration log without being asked, showed Marcus the most recent certification date, walked him through the standard explanation almost by rote. Home scales and auction scales rarely read identically. Cattle don't weigh the same at every hour of every day, and a lot can happen to an animal, between a farm shoot on a Tuesday morning and a sale ring on a Friday afternoon. It was a reasonable explanation. Marcus even nodded along with most of it, but something about it didn't sit fully right. And Marcus, not one to accept an answer just because it was plausible, decided he wanted to understand it properly rather than simply accept it. Driving home that evening, turning the ticket over in his mind, Marcus found himself circling two competing possibilities. Either his own scale had been reading heavy, which would mean every weight he'd recorded that spring was suspect, and every future sale might be shortchanged in the opposite direction of what he assumed. Or the 70-pound gap was something else entirely, something that had happened to the cow herself between those two mornings. Not a flaw in either scale at all. That distinction mattered more than it might have seemed. If his scale was wrong, that was an equipment problem with a straightforward fix. If it was something about the cow, that was knowledge. The kind of knowledge that would matter every single time he sold an animal for the rest of his career. He'd heard the term before, more times than he could count, usually in passing conversation at the sale barn or in an extension bulletin he'd skimmed and half forgotten. Shrink. Cattle, like any living creature, don't carry a fixed, unchanging weight throughout the day. Gut fill, the combined weight of feed and water actively sitting in the digestive tract at any given moment, can account for a meaningful percentage of an animal's total live weight, sometimes in the range of 8 to 12%, depending on how recently and how heavily the animal has eaten and had access to water. An animal weighed shortly after a full overnight feeding, with a belly full of hay and water, will read heavier on a scale than that same animal weighed after several hours of transport, handling, and holding, during which it typically eats little, drinks little, and loses additional weight through normal manure and urine excretion. None of that changes the animal's actual lean body condition. It changes how much material is physically inside the animal at the moment the scale registers a number. Marcus knew this in the abstract. What he didn't know yet was whether it fully explained 70 pounds on this particular cow, on this particular timeline, or whether something else was also in play. That distinction, knowing that shrink existed versus knowing whether it explained this specific number, was where Marcus's real investigation began. He sat down that weekend with his notebook and started reconstructing the timeline as precisely as he could remember it. She'd been weighed Tuesday morning after a normal overnight feeding, full access to both hay and water, same as any other animal on his place on any other morning. She'd stayed in his home pens Wednesday and most of Thursday, same routine, same feed access. Thursday evening, he'd loaded her onto the trailer for the 2-hour haul to the sale barn, arriving that night. From that point forward, her circumstances changed considerably. She'd spent the night in an auction holding pen, without the same consistent access to feed she'd have had at home, and with considerably less water intake than usual. Not from neglect, simply from the disruption and stress that comes standard with an unfamiliar environment. Other cattle, new smells, and the general commotion of a livestock market. By Friday morning, when she moved through intake and eventually into the scale house ahead of the sale, she'd gone close to 18 hours, with minimal feed and reduced water intake, on top of the physical stress of transport itself. Marcus had seen this pattern in his own cattle before, if he was honest with himself. He just hadn't ever quantified it directly against a specific sale. He pulled out 3 years of old sale tickets that evening, spreading them across his kitchen table, comparing his own pre-hauling weights, recorded in that same spiral notebook, against the final auction tickets for cattle he'd sold under similar circumstances. The pattern wasn't perfectly uniform. Nothing in livestock ever is, but it was consistent enough to notice. Nearly every animal he'd hauled to that same sale barn after an overnight hold showed a weight reduction somewhere in the range of 4 to 6% compared to what he'd recorded at home before transport. 70 pounds off of 1480 worked out to just under 5%, right in the middle of the range his own record showed. That was the moment the mystery started to crack open. Not with a dramatic revelation, but with the quiet, almost anticlimactic satisfaction of a farmer's own handwriting confirming what he suspected. The scale hadn't lied. Neither scale had lied. Both numbers were accurate measurements of the same animal at two genuinely different moments, under two genuinely different sets of physical conditions. But Marcus wasn't finished yet, because a second question had already started forming behind the first one. Was 5% shrink In this specific case, actually a normal and unavoidable outcome of an 18-hour hold? Or could some of it have been avoided with different handling? That question sent him back out to his own corrals the following week, this time with a deliberate plan rather than a casual habit. He selected a different cull cow from his herd, similar in size and condition to the one he'd already sold, and ran a controlled comparison of his own design. Nothing sophisticated, nothing a university lab would publish, just the kind of practical test a working farmer could actually repeat. He weighed her at home under the same conditions as before, full overnight feed and water access, weighed first thing in the morning. Then he held her in his own pens for a comparable 18-hour stretch, mimicking as closely as he reasonably could the reduced feed and water access she'd have experienced at an auction holding pen, before weighing her again. The second weight came in a little over 4% lighter than the first, not identical to the 70-pound discrepancy on his original cow. Nothing about livestock is ever perfectly identical, animal to animal, day to day, but close enough and consistent enough with everything else he'd already reconstructed to convince him the explanation held up under his own scrutiny, not just Dean Foss's. Marcus sat on his tailgate that evening looking at both sets of numbers and felt something settle in his chest that was closer to understanding than relief. The 70 pounds hadn't vanished through any error, any miscalibration, any shortcut on anyone's part. It had left the way gut feel always leaves an animal under those conditions, gradually, physically, predictably, once you understood what to actually look for. His daughter Hannah, 16 and increasingly interested in the operation she'd likely take over someday, asked him about it at dinner that week, the way teenagers do when something has caught their attention despite themselves. "So which number's the real one?" she asked. "The 1480 or the 1410? It was a fair question, and Marcus found himself thinking about how to answer it honestly, rather than simply correctly. "Both of them," he told her eventually. "They're both real. They're just real at different moments, under different conditions. The number by itself doesn't tell you much. What tells you something is knowing what happened right before the number showed up." His own father, Marcus mentioned to her later that same conversation, used to talk about this exact issue decades earlier, back when he was hauling cattle to that same sale barn in an era before anyone talked about it using the word shrink at all. His father had simply called it settling, the natural adjustment an animal went through between the farm and the scale, something older generations of cattlemen understood instinctively through decades of repetition even without a formal name for the underlying biology. Marcus realized, sitting with that memory, that this was really a piece of knowledge quietly at risk of being lost. Not because it was complicated, but because fewer people these days handled cattle through every stage of that journey the way his father's generation had, and fewer still stopped to compare their own numbers against the final ticket closely enough to notice the pattern at all. The stakes in all this were never abstract for Marcus. 70 pounds at that week's market price came to a real, specific dollar figure. Not enough to sink the operation, but enough to matter against a loan payment he'd been planning around for months. Understanding the discrepancy didn't put those 70 pounds back in his pocket on that particular sale. What it did was change how he planned every sale going forward. He started scheduling his hauls differently after that, when timing allowed for it, trying to minimize the length of time between his own pre-haul weighing and the actual sale, understanding that every additional hour of holding without feed and water access meant additional shrink eating into his final settlement number. He started factoring an expected shrink percentage into his own mental math before he ever loaded a trailer, so the number on the final ticket stopped feeling like a surprise and started feeling like a prediction he could reasonably verify. He also started talking to some of the younger producers around the county about it, not lecturing, just mentioning it the way it had once been mentioned to him, back when he was young enough to still be surprised by a settlement ticket that didn't match his own scale. A few of them, he noticed, had never fully separated the idea of an animal's true condition from the specific number a scale happened to display at any one moment. They looked at a ticket the way most people look at any number, as a fixed, singular fact, rather than a measurement tied tightly to a moment in time and a specific set of physical circumstances. Understanding shrink didn't change the fundamental economics of raising cattle in a hard market. It didn't make feed cheaper or interest rates friendlier. What it did was give Marcus a clearer, more accurate picture of what his cattle were actually worth at the moment of sale, and just as importantly, why that number could legitimately shift from one weighing to the next without anyone having made a mistake at all. That distinction, he came to believe, separated experienced producers from newer ones more reliably than almost anything else in the business. A number without context could mislead almost anyone. A number understood alongside its timing, its handling history, and its physical conditions became something closer to real information, the kind a person could actually plan around, negotiate around, and trust. Regional practices vary, and Marcus knew well enough not to assume every sale barn, every scale, or every set of holding conditions worked identically to his own corner of Nebraska. But the underlying principle, that a live weight only means something once you understand the circumstances behind it, held true regardless of which side of a border or an ocean a producer happened to be standing on. The evening after he finally worked through the whole explanation to his own satisfaction, Marcus walked out to check the herd one more time before dark, same as he had almost every evening of his adult life. The cull cow he'd tested at home a few weeks earlier had already rejoined the herd, settling in among the others as the light dropped low and gold across the pasture. His old spiral notebook sat closed on the kitchen counter behind him, the handwritten numbers inside it a little more meaningful now than they'd been a month earlier. The scale in the corral chute stood empty in the dusk, waiting for whichever animal needed weighing next. Marcus didn't think of that 70-pound gap as a mystery solved so much as a lesson relearned. One his father had understood without ever needing to explain it in scientific terms, and one Marcus now understood well enough to hand down properly to his daughter, should she want it. A number on a ticket, he'd come to believe, was never really the whole story. The whole story was everything that happened to the animal in the hours before that number ever appeared, and knowing how to ask about those hours, rather than simply accepting the number on its own, was very often the difference between a farmer who got surprised by his settlement checks and one who didn't.